Jim Jordan entered the hearing room with his usual confidence. His voice already warmed up for the verbal sparring he had made his signature. He thrived on being the loudest presence in the chamber, the one who could throw his opponents off balance with interruptions and relentless pacing. For years, this style had worked for him. The rapid-fire questions, the accusations layered one over the other, the tone designed to overwhelm rather than invite thoughtful answers. But what Jim Jordan didn't realize that day was that volume would not save him from the weight of the truth when Jasmine Crockett decided to speak. When Jordan began, the familiar rhythm filled the room. He barked questions, raised his tone, and leaned forward as though aggression alone could settle complex legal issues. He cited portions of the Constitution with a certainty that suggested authority. But as he spoke, anyone trained in law could see the cracks. His interpretations were loose, sometimes outright wrong, and his framing of precedents seemed more like selective quoting than genuine understanding. For those who didn't know better, his forcefulness could have passed as knowledge. But Crockett knew better. She didn't have to raise her voice to notice how misplaced his arguments were. She didn't even flinch as his tone grew sharper, because she understood something he didn't. In matters of law, facts and precedent always outlast volume. When her moment arrived, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone with a composure that contrasted sharply with Jordan's brash style. She began slowly, almost methodically, setting the stage with clarity that resonated even through the chaos of a heated hearing. Each point she made was tethered to solid ground, a statute here, a ruling there, and the unmistakable language of the Supreme Court written in black and white. While Jordan had leaned on performance, she leaned on substance, and as she did, the room began to shift. Jordan, who was not accustomed to being challenged with such precision, attempted to cut in. His instinct was always to drown out opposition with his voice, to reclaim the room with force. But Crockett didn't falter. She didn't shout back. She simply picked up her papers, read directly from the legal text, and left no room for misinterpretation. The more she spoke, the more Jordan's interruptions sounded hollow. His usual tactic overpowering through aggression was suddenly ineffective. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. At first, Jordan tried again, insisting she was twisting the meaning, that her reading of the law was off base. But Crockett didn't argue with him. She simply read the line again, word for word, this time slowing down so the entire chamber could hear it clearly. Her calmness wasn't just poise, it was power. The facts didn't need embellishment, they stood strong on their own. And in that moment, Jim Jordan's booming voice, the same one that had made headlines for years, seemed smaller than it had ever been. It became clear to everyone present that Jordan was not being silenced by force, but by knowledge. Crockett didn't need to raise her hand or call for order. She exposed the weakness in his arguments so thoroughly that the only thing left for him to do was stop talking. It was a stunning reversal. The man who prided himself on always being the loudest was left with no words. Not because someone shouted him down, but because someone showed him that noise without substance cannot stand against truth. Observers in the room caught the weight of the moment. This wasn't about a clash of personalities. It was about the undeniable difference between bluster and authority. Jordan had built his reputation on the former, and in that chamber, Jasmine Crockett embodied the latter. By relying on her legal training and letting the facts speak louder than her tone, she stripped away the illusion that volume equals strength. Jim Jordan, for once, was forced into silence not by rules, not by intervention, but by the stark contrast between noise and knowledge. Jim Jordan had always believed that dominating the room meant being prepared. His preparation, however, often focused less on the law itself and more on the theater of politics. He thrived on rehearsing lines that could ignite headlines, on sharpening attacks that would look strong on camera, and on crafting a tone that conveyed confidence even when the content underneath was thin. In his world, preparation meant ammunition for spectacle. But when Jasmine Crockett stepped forward in that hearing, she showed what real preparation looked like, the kind that isn't about optics but about mastery. As the exchange began, Jordan rattled off his points, each laced with the conviction of someone convinced that confidence substitutes for correctness. He waved documents, cited pieces of the Constitution, and fired accusations that gave the appearance of authority. Yet those who listened closely could hear the gaps. His references were surface-level, carefully chosen fragments that ignored the larger legal framework. He had prepared for a show, not for a battle of substance. Crockett, by contrast, had prepared for both. She had not only studied the issues, but had grounded herself in the kind of depth that only comes from years of working with the law. When her turn came, the contrast was immediate. Crockett didn't rush. She didn't seem flustered by Jordan's aggressive presence or his interruptions. She opened her folder and began laying out her case like a lawyer before a jury. Each piece of information was carefully aligned with the next. She spoke of precedents, quoting their names and dates as if they were etched in memory. She wove statutes into her argument with clarity, demonstrating that she had not only read them but had understood and internalized them. Her preparation wasn't for show, it was for truth. and that difference became impossible to ignore. Jordan tried to reassert himself, but the weakness of his preparation became glaring. He leaned on repetition, circling back to the same points as if saying them louder, or more often would make them true. But Crockett anticipated these moves. Her preparation had covered not only the facts, but the counter-arguments, and she had answers ready for each one. When he cited an interpretation, she corrected him with the actual language. When he invoked history, she provided the broader context he had left out. With every exchange, it was clear she had walked into the chamber, armed not just with notes, but with knowledge honed from deliberate and thorough work. The silence that overtook Jordan wasn't sudden, but gradual. His voice grew less certain the more she spoke. He hesitated before responding, clearly realizing that his preparation was no match for hers. And in politics, where perception is often as powerful as reality, that hesitation was damning. For once, the cameras weren't capturing Jim Jordan in command of the room, they were capturing him outmaneuvered. His confidence undercut by the sheer thoroughness of someone who had done the harder work. Observers later noted how Crockett's approach revealed something often overlooked in Congress, that the ones who seem the loudest are not always the ones most prepared. Jordan's preparation had been about energy, about controlling the room through volume and persistence, but Crockett's preparation was about facts, context, and foresight. That was why she never faltered. She didn't need to scramble for answers or buy time with noise. She had already anticipated the storm and built a foundation solid enough to stand through it. For Jordan. The moment was humbling. He had built a career on controlling narratives, but he could not control the precision of a legal mind prepared down to the last detail. Every attempt to wrestle the floor back from Crockett was met with a calm rebuttal that only made him look less ready. What he had mistaken for strength as bluster was revealed as a weakness when confronted with someone whose preparation left no cracks to exploit. By the end of the exchange, Crockett had done more than silence him. She had shifted the definition of preparation in the eyes of the public. To be prepared wasn't to have talking points and a raised voice. It was to know the material so thoroughly that no interruption could shake it. Jordan's weakness that day was not his voice or even his arguments, but his failure to prepare in the way that mattered most. Crockett showed the difference, and in doing so, she reminded the chamber and the country that preparation, when genuine, is a form of power that no volume can match. Jim Jordan had built a reputation on projecting strength. His style of questioning in hearings often relied on putting others on the defensive, using volume and speed to make it seem as though he held the upper hand. But in this particular moment, it wasn't strength that the public was weakness exposed. For years, Jordan's tactics had been effective in creating the illusion of command. Yet illusions can only survive until someone shines a brighter light. Jasmine Crockett, with her background in law and her careful approach, provided that light. And in doing so, she revealed just how fragile Jordan's foundation was when it came to matters of legal understanding. When he spoke, Jordan tried to lean on authority. His words carried the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed, and his body language was the same as always, leaning forward, pointing, commanding attention. But beneath that performance was a noticeable lack of depth. As he pressed his points, the inconsistencies became clearer, especially to anyone familiar with the legal system. He was not building a case. He was recycling phrases, stitching together fragments that sounded sharp but collapsed under scrutiny, and Crockett was listening closely, waiting for the moment to step in. When she finally did, the change in the room was almost palpable. Crockett didn't start by attacking him personally or mocking his style. Instead, she walked directly into the substance of his claims. She laid down precedents that flatly contradicted his positions, drawing from Supreme Court rulings that were too concrete to ignore. Each citation was deliberate, each reference crafted to dismantle the points he had raised. What made it powerful was that she didn't need to embellish or dramatize. She simply put the truth in front of everyone. Jordan tried to respond, but his attempts revealed what he lacked. He hadn't done the work to back up his statements, so when Crockett challenged him with precise legal language, his rebuttals came across as shallow. He grew visibly unsettled, cutting in with interruptions that carried more frustration than authority. What had once been his strength, his loud voice, his determination to dominate, was suddenly ineffective. Every time he tried to push back, Crockett countered with facts that silenced the room. For Jordan, the exposure was gradual but undeniable. Each time he faltered, it reinforced that his authority was built more on presentation than preparation. His ignorance of the very legal framework he claimed to defend was laid bare in real time. The cameras captured not just the words, but the shift in dynamic. The man who had always used volume as a weapon now found himself grasping for footing against someone who didn't need to raise her voice at all. Observers noticed that Crockett's calmness played a key role in amplifying his weakness. By not matching his aggression, she highlighted how misplaced it was. By refusing to engage in a shouting contest, she made the silence that followed her points even heavier. Jordan's inability to counter effectively only deepened the impression that he was out of his depth. The more he struggled, the more obvious it became that he wasn't being silenced by procedure, but by the reality that he lacked the tools to stand on equal ground with her knowledge. Asterisk, it wasn't just about one exchange in a hearing. It was about what the moment represented. Jim Jordan had fashioned himself as a relentless fighter, someone who could bulldoze opponents with persistence. But when faced with someone who came prepared with more than talking points, he was forced into a corner where bluster couldn't save him. His exposure wasn't a dramatic takedown, it was a steady unraveling, point by point, until there was nothing left for him to hide behind. Asterisk, by the end, his weakness was no longer an open secret whispered among critics. It was visible to the entire country. Crockett had not only defended herself but had revealed the cracks in the armor of a man who prided himself on always being in control. And in politics, few things are more shocking than watching someone known for their dominance suddenly shown to be vulnerable, not because of personal attack, but because their ignorance was exposed in plain view. The hearing had begun as just another display of political theater, with Jim Jordan stepping into the spotlight as he so often did, ready to take control of the narrative. His approach had always been straightforward: speak louder, move faster, and frame the conversation so that his voice dominated above all others. But what unfolded in that room reshaped the way many observers thought about power in Congress. It wasn't a clash of personalities, though it might have looked that way on the surface. It was the realization that, for all of Jordan's bluster, what truly matters in those moments is who can anchor their words in facts that cannot be bent. Jasmine Crockett did exactly that, and in doing so, she shifted the balance in a way few had expected. Asterisk, when Jordan began his questioning, the room carried the familiar energy of his style. He pushed aggressively, firing off assertions that sounded convincing to those who might not look deeper. His strength had always been his ability to create a perception, to make it seem as though he was the one holding all the cards. He framed his points as though they were unshakable truths, counting on his speed and volume to keep others from finding the gaps. For a while, he managed to hold that stage, until Crockett took her turn. Asterisk, her approach was the opposite of his. Where Jordan thrived on speed, she relied on patience. Where he raised his voice, she steadied hers. And where he relied on appearance, she turned to substance. With her legal background, she brought forward not just arguments, but evidence. Each point was connected to a ruling, a statute, or the precise wording of constitutional law. She didn't rush, and she didn't let the weight of his performance push her off course. Instead, she let the truth do the work, carefully placing it piece by piece until the contrast was undeniable. Asterisk, Jordan tried to interrupt, but each time he did, the interruptions weakened his position. The public and the chamber alike could see the difference between a man trying to overpower the conversation and a woman who had come prepared with facts that could not be dismissed. His strategy of creating confusion no longer worked, because Crockett refused to engage in the chaos. She simply returned to her citations, reading directly from the text, leaving him with no room to twist her words. Asterisk, the shift in narrative happened quietly but powerfully. What had begun as Jordan's usual show of force turned into a lesson on how little force matters when it isn't supported by substance. His silence, when it finally came, wasn't the result of rules or someone cutting him off. It was the natural conclusion of being faced with an argument he couldn't refute, and that silence told the story more loudly than his voice ever could. Asterisk, for those watching, it was more than just one exchange in a long day of hearings. It was a reminder that politics isn't only about who can talk the longest or loudest. It's about who can withstand scrutiny, who can stand on facts that remain solid even under pressure. Crockett showed that day that a well-prepared argument grounded in truth has the power to not only hold ground, but to completely turn the tide. Asterisk. Jordan's image took a hit that went beyond the moment. The man who had built his reputation on relentless energy had been stopped, not with equal force, but with calm precision, and that redefined the way the narrative was told afterward. No longer was it simply about him being the loudest voice in the room. It was about him being the one who had no answer when confronted with actual knowledge. Crockett, by contrast, walked away not just as someone who had held her own, but as the figure who had exposed how fragile the performance of dominance really is when it isn't backed up by substance. Asterisk. The shift was so stark because it revealed something larger about leadership and credibility. Jordan had leaned for years on the assumption that his style would always prevail, but Crockett's performance showed that style without substance eventually falters. In that chamber, with cameras rolling and the public watching, the story turned. It was no longer about a congressman controlling the room with noise. It was about a congresswoman reshaping the meaning of control through quiet, steady authority. That shift will linger longer than the sound of any raised voice, because it wasn't manufactured, it was earned in real time. The moment that played out in the chamber was more than a sharp exchange between two members of Congress. It was a turning point in how people viewed authority, preparation, and truth in the political arena. Jim Jordan had built a career on the belief that force of voice could overpower the weight of facts. He believed that if he stayed aggressive enough, if he pressed his points loudly enough, he could dominate any room. But on this day, facing Jasmine Crockett, that strategy collapsed under the simple reality that noise cannot withstand knowledge. Asterisk. Crockett never needed to raise her tone to match him. She never resorted to spectacle or distraction. Instead, she anchored herself in the discipline of her legal training. Every word she spoke was chosen carefully, not for effect, but for accuracy. Each precedent she cited was clear and irrefutable, building a structure of truth that could not be shaken no matter how many times Jordan tried to push back. Her calmness was not a lack of passion but a sign of confidence. The confidence that comes from knowing your foundation cannot be moved. Asterisk. Jordan's silence at the end of their exchange was not just the quiet of a man momentarily caught off guard. It was the silence of someone confronted with the limits of his own approach. He had prepared for a fight of volume and pressure, but he had not prepared for a contest of facts and law. His voice, once his greatest weapon, became irrelevant when there was nothing left to support it. Crockett didn't win by outshouting him. She won by outlasting him with clarity and truth. Asterisk, the significance of that moment reaches beyond the hearing itself. It revealed that politics does not have to be defined by who can speak the loudest, but by who can speak with the greatest substance. It reminded people that authority isn't about intimidation, but about credibility. And it proved that preparation grounded in real expertise has the power to change the narrative in ways that performance never can. Asterisk, for Jordan, the lesson was clear. His style of dominance, long effective in creating headlines and capturing attention, was vulnerable when challenged by someone who brought more than theater to the table. For Crockett, the moment elevated her voice in the national conversation, showing that strength is not always loud, it is sometimes quiet, steady, and unshakable. Asterisk, the exchange will be remembered not because Jordan shouted, but because Crockett didn't need to. It will be remembered because in that silence, the truth stood taller than the noise. And it will be remembered as a rare moment in modern politics where the weight of knowledge, calmly delivered, reshaped the room and rewrote the story of who really held power that